The little girl's scream was a raw, primal sound that sliced through the golden tranquility of Riverside Park, freezing joggers in mid-stride and silencing laughter from nearby picnic-goers. She stood there trembling, her tiny hands clenched into fists, as she watched her father, Ethan Carter, being shoved forcefully against a park bench by a white police officer. Tears poured down her flushed cheeks, her innocent eyes wide with terror, as she tried to understand why her dad, a man she knew to be strong, kind, and brave, was being treated like a dangerous criminal.
"Daddy!"
She cried, her voice cracking under the weight of confusion and fear. Her desperation echoed in the crisp autumn air, catching the attention of a crowd that slowly began to gather. Some people pulled out their phones, recording with disbelief. Others exchanged shocked glances, whispers of, "Why are they doing this to him?" running through the growing throng. Ethan's heart clenched painfully at his daughter's cry, but he forced himself to remain calm, even as the officer's grip tightened around his wrists, the cold metal of the cuffs biting into his skin. His tailored navy blue suit, a symbol of his success and respectability, felt like a cruel mockery in this moment. He was a respected businessman, a leader in his community, but none of that mattered now. Here, in the eyes of authority, he was reduced to just another suspect, a perceived threat. The book on civil rights history he'd been reading lay abandoned on the ground, pages fluttering in the breeze, a silent testament to the bitter irony unfolding. Around them, the park seemed to hold its breath. A street musician, who had been playing a soulful saxophone tune, let his instrument slip from his fingers, the music dying in his throat as he watched the scene with dread. Parents pulled their children closer, shielding them from the ugly reality taking shape before them. Yet some faces in the crowd wore an all too familiar resignation, as if they had seen this play out far too many times before. Ethan closed his eyes for a brief moment, fighting the wave of humiliation and fury rising inside him. He couldn't afford to react, couldn't afford to let his anger show. Not here, not in front of his little girl, who needed him to be strong and composed. But deep in his gut, a familiar ache settled, the painful reminder that no matter how successful he became, no matter how much good he did for his community, he would always have to fight for his right to exist peacefully in his own skin. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over Riverside Park, painting long shadows across the pathways where joggers moved with rhythmic strides and families spread out picnic blankets on patches of still vibrant grass. The breeze, crisp with the scent of autumn, rustled the leaves high in the ancient oaks, sending red and gold confetti dancing through the air. A street musician stood near the main fountain, his saxophone crooning a soulful melody that seemed to hang like magic in the autumnal air. Ethan Carter sat on a park bench, dressed in a tailored navy blue suit. The 40-year-old black businessman exuded an air of calm authority, but his eyes held the quiet vigilance of someone who had seen more than his share of battles. At 40, he was in the prime of his career, a highly respected businessman and a fierce advocate for civil rights. Today, his presence in the park wasn't about power or influence. It was about a rare moment of tranquility. The thick hardcover book in his hands, a well-worn volume on civil rights history, was both a source of inspiration and a painful reminder of the battles still being fought. As he flipped another page, a young couple walked past, laughing softly as they shared a moment only they understood. A child, no more than 5 or 6, raced past, chasing a runaway balloon that danced in the wind. The child's laughter was infectious, a pure, joyful sound that momentarily lifted Ethan's spirits. He closed his eyes briefly, soaking in the ambiance, the rare harmony of a city momentarily at peace. But peace, he knew, was often fragile, like a delicate glass sculpture balanced on the edge of a table. His mind drifted to the countless times he had been reminded that even the most accomplished black man could still be treated as less than human. The indignities, both small and large, had built an armor around him, one that he never took off, even in moments of serenity like this. Across the park, Officer Jake Miller finished another sweep of his patrol. A veteran with a no-nonsense demeanor, Jake's sharp eyes scanned the scenery. He had walked this beat for years and took pride in knowing the neighborhood like the back of his hand. His approach to policing had always been rooted in gut instinct, a sixth sense honed over years of walking the beat, reinforced by stories told over late-night coffee breaks and whispered warnings passed down from older officers. Today, something felt off. His eyes, trained to spot the unusual, locked onto Ethan, a black man in an expensive suit, sitting alone and seemingly unbothered. Jake's brow furrowed. There was nothing inherently wrong with the image, but something in his gut twisted, a discomfort he couldn't quite explain. Maybe it was the reports he'd skimmed earlier, vague mentions of a suspect in a series of petty crimes, with descriptors so general they barely painted a picture. But still, Jake's suspicion, uninvited and unwarranted, latched onto Ethan like a shadow. Jake adjusted his duty belt, his fingers brushing the cold metal of his holstered weapon. His heart thumped with a familiar adrenaline, the kind he had learned to trust. Years of patrolling these streets had taught him that staying alert, no, hyper-vigilant, was the key to making it home safely. He didn't question where this instinct came from, or why it seemed to stir more readily around people who looked like Ethan. It was a reflex, ingrained and unexamined, a survival tactic he thought of as second nature. Ethan, though deeply immersed in his book, felt the prickle of awareness dance along his spine. It was a feeling he had known since he was a boy, a sense that warned him when he was being watched, scrutinized. Slowly, he lifted his gaze from the page, his expression composed but alert. Across the way, he saw Officer Miller's eyes fixed on him. Ethan's grip on the book tightened ever so slightly, the tension coiling inside him like a spring. He had faced this gaze before, 1,000 variations of it, each one carrying its own subtle or overt threat. His mind, ever strategic, began to assess the situation. Was it worth engaging? Would it escalate if he made eye contact for too long? Or would avoidance be taken as an admission of guilt? These calculations, these constant mental gymnastics, were exhausting but necessary. They were the unspoken rituals of survival in a world that often refused to see his humanity. Meanwhile, the park carried on around them, oblivious to the unspoken battle taking shape. An elderly man sat feeding pigeons, crumbs falling from his hands as he hummed an old tune. 2 teenage girls giggled as they took selfies with the autumn foliage in the background, their carefree laughter a stark contrast to the growing tension between Ethan and Jake. Jake's gaze lingered on Ethan, analyzing every detail. The book, the suit, the composed posture. Everything about Ethan seemed calculated, deliberate, and it unnerved Jake. He had arrested his share of people who looked calm, collected, and put together, only to find out they were anything but innocent. His gut told him there was more to this man, and Jake had learned to trust his gut, even when he didn't fully understand why. But there was another side to Jake's instincts, one he rarely examined. The side molded by years of stereotypes and unspoken biases, the stories that painted certain people as more dangerous, more suspect, without evidence. It was a part of him he had never questioned, a part that now had him moving toward Ethan, his steps slow but purposeful. Ethan's eyes didn't waver as Jake approached, but inside his frustration simmered. It was the same story, over and over. He was tired of it, tired of having to defend his right to exist peacefully in a public space. But he knew he had to be careful. There was no room for error, no space for anger, no matter how justified it might be. The street musician, Darnell Williams, paused in his playing, his hands freezing on the keys of his saxophone as he noticed the unfolding scene. Darnell had seen situations like this before, had watched them escalate in ways that left people hurt or worse. His pulse quickened, and he debated whether to intervene or stay silent. The music that had once brought life to the park now felt hollow, drowned out by the heavy silence settling over the area. Nearby, Sofia Ramirez, a journalist out for her afternoon jog, slowed her pace. Her reporter's instincts kicked in, and she felt her pulse quicken. She had covered stories of police bias before, written about the way small encounters could spiral into life-altering events. Seeing it unfold before her eyes made the air feel colder, the park's beauty dimmed by the shadow of tension. Jake stopped a few feet from Ethan, his posture authoritative but not yet confrontational. "Afternoon," he said, his voice firm but forced into politeness, the kind of tone that tried to sound non-threatening but failed, carrying an edge that made Ethan's muscles tighten. Ethan looked up, meeting the officer's gaze with the same calm composure he had mastered over years of encounters like this. "Afternoon, officer," he replied, his voice even. His hands stayed visible, resting lightly on the closed book in his lap. Jake studied Ethan, his eyes flicking between the book and Ethan's face, searching for something that would confirm his gut feeling. "What brings you out here today?" he asked, the question casual but weighted. It wasn't a friendly inquiry. It was an interrogation wrapped in small talk. Ethan resisted the urge to sigh. He knew the dance well. "Just enjoying the park," he said. "It's a beautiful day." His voice held no fear, only a weariness that came from repeating the same conversation countless times. Jake's jaw tightened. Something about Ethan's calmness, his lack of fear or nervousness, made him uneasy. He had expected, wanted a different reaction, something that would justify his suspicions. The silence between them thickened, charged with all the things left unsaid. From her vantage point, Sophia began recording on her phone, her heart pounding. This wasn't just another jog in the park. It was the beginning of a story she knew too well, but still couldn't believe she was witnessing firsthand. She captured the way Ethan remained composed, the way Jake's hand hovered just a little too close to his baton, the tension that everyone around them seemed to feel. Ethan felt the weight of all the eyes on him, the silent witnesses to an encounter that could shift from tense to dangerous in an instant. But he refused to let fear control him. He had spent his life learning how to navigate moments like this, how to turn his rage into resolve, his vulnerability into quiet strength. "Is there a problem, officer?" Ethan asked, his voice carefully measured. The question hung in the air, a challenge wrapped in civility, and it was enough to make Jake's grip on his baton tighten. The ride to the precinct was tense and suffocating, the silence in the patrol car thick with unspoken words and mounting frustration. Ethan sat in the back seat, his wrists sore from the handcuffs that cut into his skin with every bump in the road. He gazed out the window, his expression unreadable, though inside he could feel the familiar weight of exhaustion pressing down on him. The streets of the city blurred past, a rush of color and movement, but Ethan's mind wasn't on the passing scenery. He was thinking ahead, planning, because he knew that his fight was only just beginning. Officer Jake Miller drove with one hand tightly gripping the wheel, his knuckles white, his jaw clenched. His eyes darted to the rearview mirror every few moments, checking on Ethan as if expecting him to do something, anything that would justify the sense of unease gnawing at his gut. But Ethan did nothing, said nothing. He sat still, composed, refusing to give Jake the satisfaction of seeing him break. The closer they got to the precinct, the more memories flooded Ethan's mind. He thought about the countless times he had been in situations like this, where the color of his skin had rendered him guilty until proven innocent. Each experience had left a mark, an invisible scar that fueled his determination to advocate for change. Yet no matter how much he accomplished or how respected he became, these moments never got easier. The sting of injustice never dulled. Finally, they pulled into the precinct parking lot and Jake parked the car, stepping out quickly to open the back door. The noise of the city seemed to fade away, replaced by the hum of fluorescent lights and the faint buzz of police radios. Jake guided Ethan out of the car, his grip firm on Ethan's arm, and led him inside. The precinct was busy, as it always was, but the sight of Ethan being escorted in handcuffs drew a few curious glances. Captain Lauren Davis stood at her desk in the main office area, her attention divided between a stack of paperwork and a phone call. A woman in her late 40s, Captain Davis had seen more than her share of controversy and chaos, and she ran her precinct with a firm but fair hand. When she caught sight of Jake bringing in Ethan, her eyes narrowed. Something about the scene felt wrong, and her instincts told her this was more than just a routine arrest. The main office buzzed with activity. A rookie officer named Brian Kim, barely a year into his service, watched the scene unfold with wide, uncertain eyes. He had joined the force with high ideals, wanting to make a difference, but moments like these made him question the reality of the system he was a part of. Beside him, Officer Maria Gonzalez, a seasoned cop with years of experience, shook her head slightly, her lips pressed into a thin line. She had seen too many arrests that never should have happened, but voicing her concerns rarely led to change. Jake brought Ethan to the processing desk, where a young officer named Ryan Jenkins was handling paperwork. Jenkins looked up from his computer, his eyes widening slightly as he took in the scene. Ethan Carter was a name that carried weight in the city, a man known for his work in business and community advocacy. The recognition was fleeting, but it was there, and Jenkins swallowed nervously. "What's this about?" Jenkins asked, his voice tight. Jake didn't meet his colleague's eyes. "Suspicious behavior in the park," he said curtly, shoving Ethan's ID across the desk. The explanation sounded flimsy even to him, but he wasn't about to back down now. Pride and years of habit held him in place, even as a sliver of doubt began to worm its way into his mind. Jenkins picked up the ID, glancing at Ethan and then at Jake. "Suspicious, huh?" he murmured, his tone laced with disbelief. But he quickly masked it, typing Ethan's information into the system. The room seemed to hum with tension, officers exchanging looks and shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Ethan remained silent, his expression cool and composed. But his silence wasn't submission. It was strategic, a calm before the storm. He knew he was being watched, evaluated, and he refused to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing him falter. Captain Davis finished her phone call and approached, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of the situation. "Miller?" she called out, her voice steady but carrying an unmistakable authority. "A word, please." Jake stiffened but obeyed, leaving Ethan at the processing desk as he followed Captain Davis into her office. The moment the door closed behind them, Davis turned to Jake, her eyes narrowing. "Explain," she demanded. Jake shifted uncomfortably, his earlier confidence slipping. "He was acting suspicious, Captain," he said, but the words felt hollow, even to him. "Sitting alone, looking out of place. I had a gut feeling." Davis's expression darkened. "A gut feeling? Are you serious?" she asked, her voice lowering to a dangerous calm. "Do you know who that man is, Miller?" Jake swallowed. "No, ma'am," he admitted. Davis leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. "That man is Ethan Carter. He's a prominent businessman and a senior advisor on community police relations for the mayor's office." Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Jake's face paled, the gravity of his mistake finally sinking in. But before he could respond, Davis held up a hand to silence him. "We'll discuss this later. For now, stay out of the way." Outside the office, Ethan was finally uncuffed, the marks from the cuffs still visible on his wrists. Jenkins avoided his gaze as he stepped back, and Ethan rubbed his wrists, exhaling a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. But the battle wasn't over yet, not by a long shot. Sofia Ramirez, who had followed the entire situation from the park to the precinct, stood just outside the building, her phone still recording. She knew she had the makings of a major story, one that could shine a harsh light on the very issues Ethan had spent his life fighting against. But Sofia also knew that this story came with a responsibility, to tell it with the nuance and gravity it deserved. She remembered her first major story, one that had made waves but also cost her the trust of certain sources. It had been a lesson in the power of the narrative, in how words could both uplift and destroy. Watching Ethan now, Sofia felt the weight of that responsibility pressing down on her again. She wanted to do more than just report. She wanted to make a difference. Back inside, Captain Davis approached Ethan, her face a mix of professionalism and regret. "Mr. Carter," she began, her voice carefully measured, "I'm truly sorry for what you've been put through. We'll sort this out immediately." Ethan met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "I appreciate that, Captain," he said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of exhaustion and barely concealed frustration. "But you and I both know this is about more than just today. This is about a system that's broken." Davis's eyes darkened, the truth in his words cutting deep. She had spent years trying to balance the demands of her position with her own sense of justice, and moments like this one reminded her of how fragile that balance was. "You're right," she said, the tension in her shoulders visible. "And we need to have that conversation. But first, let me make this right." Ethan's eyes softened just for a moment, but the fire in them never dimmed. "I'm ready when you are," he replied. The scene in the precinct buzzed with a different kind of energy now. Officers whispered among themselves, exchanging nervous glances as the reality of what had just unfolded began to sink in. Ethan stood tall, unbroken, a man who had been dragged through the mud but still carried the strength of his convictions. And as Captain Davis began to take steps to rectify the situation, it was clear that this was only the beginning of a much larger reckoning. The precinct was a hive of activity, with officers moving in and out of the main office area, the noise of ringing phones and clicking keyboards filling the air. Yet amid the usual chaos, a different kind of tension had settled in. It felt heavy, like an impending storm waiting to break. Ethan stood by the processing desk, his wrists still stinging from the handcuffs. The marks on his skin were a physical reminder of the humiliation he had just endured, but his expression remained composed. He was no stranger to this feeling, the sense of being dehumanized despite every accomplishment, despite the respect he had worked so hard to earn. But this time, he wouldn't let the incident be swept under the rug. Sofia Ramirez, having made her way inside the precinct, observed the scene quietly from a corner. Her camera phone was still in hand, the footage she had captured burning a metaphorical hole in her pocket. She knew the impact this story could have, but she also knew the risks. Sofia's gaze flicked over to Ethan, who seemed to radiate a quiet strength even in the face of injustice. Her instinct screamed that this story was more than just another article. It was a chance to make a difference. Officer Ryan Jenkins, still stationed at the processing desk, fidgeted nervously. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was witnessing a grave mistake unfold. His fingers tapped restlessly on the keyboard, the clacking sound echoing in his head like a guilty reminder. He stole a glance at Ethan, feeling a pang of guilt. This man didn't deserve this, and deep down, Jenkins knew it. Meanwhile, Jake Miller stood by the break room door, the reprimand from Captain Davis still ringing in his ears. His pride was wounded, his authority questioned, and the realization that he had arrested someone important gnawed at his ego. He watched Ethan from a distance, his face set in a hard line, but something else simmered beneath the surface. Uncertainty. For the first time, Jake questioned whether he had let his biases cloud his judgment. Darnell Williams, the street musician, had followed the unfolding drama as well. He lingered just outside the precinct, his saxophone case still in hand. Darnell had seen enough of these situations to know how they often ended, and the thought of it made his stomach churn. He leaned against the cold stone wall, his eyes closed for a moment as he gathered his thoughts. The melody he had been playing in the park replayed in his mind, a bittersweet reminder of how quickly peace could shatter. Inside, Captain Lauren Davis emerged from her office, her expression composed but her mind racing. She approached Ethan, who stood tall despite the fatigue in his eyes. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice carrying both authority and a note of apology. "I've made arrangements for your release. We're reviewing the footage from Officer Miller's body camera, and I assure you this matter will be investigated thoroughly." Ethan nodded, but his jaw remained tight. "Thank you, Captain," he replied. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, a determination that could not be ignored. "However, I hope you understand that this incident won't just disappear. It's not just about me. It's about the message this sends to the entire community." Davis's eyes met his, and for a moment the weight of her position felt unbearable. She knew Ethan was right. She had spent years trying to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the community, but incidents like this one threatened to undo all that work. "I understand," she said, her voice quieter now, "and I'm committed to making sure it doesn't go unaddressed." Ethan took a breath, the exhaustion washing over him in waves. But before he could respond, the front doors of the precinct swung open with a loud creak, drawing everyone's attention. A young woman, barely in her 20s, stumbled in, her face flushed and eyes wide with panic. "Help!" she gasped, clutching her side. Someone's hurt in the alley behind the park." The room froze for a second before bursting into motion. Officers sprang into action, grabbing radios and rushing toward the scene. The urgency was palpable, and for a moment the focus shifted away from Ethan's arrest. But he couldn't shake the sense of irony. How quickly the world moved on, even in the face of blatant injustice. Jake Miller felt a surge of relief at the distraction, an excuse to escape the uncomfortable scrutiny he was under. He exchanged a look with one of his fellow officers before hurrying out the door, his hand resting on his holster. It was a familiar role for him, responding to emergencies, and he clung to it like a lifeline. Sofia, however, saw an opportunity. She approached Ethan, her voice low but urgent. "Mr. Carter," she said, "I'm a journalist. I was at the park when everything happened. I recorded the entire thing." She paused, studying his reaction. "If you're willing, I'd like to share your story. The public needs to know what happened here. Ethan turned to her, his eyes narrowing slightly. He had worked with the media before, knew how stories could be twisted or sensationalized, but something about Sophia's earnest expression gave him pause. He saw not just a journalist hungry for a scoop, but a young woman who genuinely wanted to make a difference. "I'm willing," he said finally, his voice steady, "but only if the story is told truthfully. No exaggeration, no twisting my words." Sophia nodded, a spark of determination lighting up her face. "You have my word," she promised, her heart pounding with the weight of what she had just committed to. As the chaos unfolded around them, a ripple of consequence began to spread. Jake Miller rushed to the scene of the new emergency, unaware that his actions earlier that day would continue to haunt him. Darnell Williams remained outside, his fingers brushing the keys of his saxophone, trying to bring himself to play something that could soothe the anxiety churning in his chest. And Ethan, now free from the handcuffs but still carrying the weight of what had happened, stood at the center of it all. He knew this was only the beginning. The real battle was yet to come, a fight not just for his own dignity, but for the respect and equality that his community deserved. The air inside the precinct buzzed with tension as the emergency call from the young woman continued to stir the officers into action. Radios crackled with updates, and officers scrambled to respond, some rushing toward the scene in the alley behind the park. The crowd of onlookers had grown, and anxiety pulsed through the gathered masses. Ethan Carter watched the chaos unfold, his every muscle coiled with tension. His arrest, once the focal point of the precinct, had now become just another moment swept away by a new crisis. But Ethan's mind remained sharp, calculating. The injustice he had just experienced lingered in his veins, but he was too practiced, too disciplined, to let anger control him. He had been here before, and he knew this moment was crucial, one where he could still make an impact. Sophia Ramirez continued recording, her phone capturing the unfolding drama, but her focus remained on Ethan. His calm under pressure, his unbreakable composure, was a story in itself. But she sensed that what happened next could change everything. The tension in the air felt like a drawn bowstring, ready to snap at any moment. Just as Captain Lauren Davis was about to return to her office, a sharp voice cut through the chaos. "Captain Davis!" Detective Marcus Lee called, his voice carrying urgency. He held a tablet in his hands, his brow furrowed. "You need to see this. It's the body cam footage from Officer Miller." Davis stiffened, her gaze flicking between the tablet and Ethan, who now stood with his hands at his sides, a silent witness to his own struggle. She knew that reviewing the footage would either confirm or challenge everything Jake Miller had claimed. The weight of that responsibility pressed heavily on her. "Show me," Davis ordered, her voice firm but laced with an underlying tension. Marcus approached, tapping the screen. The footage began to play, and the room seemed to grow quieter, as if everyone in the vicinity had instinctively paused to listen. The video began with Jake's approach to Ethan in the park. The officer's tone, his posture, the way his hand hovered near his baton. It was all there, undeniable and damning. Ethan stood silently as the footage continued, his own heart pounding in his chest. The video captured his calm demeanor, his measured words, and Jake's escalating aggression. It was difficult to watch, a painful reminder of how close the situation had come to spiraling out of control. The reality of his experience, now laid bare for all to see, carried a weight that pressed into his chest. Captain Davis's expression grew darker with each passing second. The evidence was clear. There had been no reason, no true provocation, nothing that justified the way Jake had treated Ethan. When the footage ended, Davis closed her eyes for a moment, letting the gravity of the situation wash over her. "Thank you, Detective," she said, her voice tight. She turned to Ethan, and the remorse in her eyes was genuine. "Mr. Carter, it's clear that you were treated unfairly. I will personally ensure that this incident is investigated thoroughly and that Officer Miller is held accountable." But before Ethan could respond, the door to the precinct burst open once more, and Jake Miller stumbled inside. His uniform was disheveled, and a streak of dirt smeared his cheek. His eyes were wild, a mix of panic and desperation. "Captain," he shouted, drawing the attention of everyone in the room. "We need backup. It's chaos out there." The officers in the room exchanged glances, their confusion palpable. But Davis's attention remained fixed on Jake, her expression unreadable. "Calm down, Miller," she ordered. "What happened?" Jake swallowed, his throat dry. "The situation in the alley, it's bad. Some of the suspects we've been tracking, they're there, and it's turning into a standoff. We need more men out there." Davis's jaw clenched. The precinct was already stretched thin, and the chaos of the day had only made things worse. But before she could issue orders, Ethan spoke up, his voice cutting through the tension. "Captain," he said, drawing both her and Jake's attention, "let me help." Jake turned on him, his face a mask of disbelief. "Help? Are you serious?" His voice was laced with incredulity, as if the idea was too absurd to consider. Ethan's gaze didn't waver. "Yes, I'm more familiar with the community than any of you. If there are people out there in a standoff, I can talk to them. I can de-escalate the situation." Sophia's eyes widened, her phone still recording. The story was shifting before her eyes, becoming something even more profound. Here was a man who had just been wronged, yet he was offering to put himself in the middle of a dangerous situation to help. Davis hesitated, torn between protocol and the logic in Ethan's words. She knew he was right. The community trusted him in ways they didn't trust the police. And if there was even a chance he could help, it was worth considering. Jake, however, was not convinced. "Absolutely not," he snapped. "This isn't some PR stunt." "Enough!" Davis cut him off, her voice ringing with authority. She turned back to Ethan, searching his eyes for any sign of hesitation. But there was none, only determination. "You understand the risk?" she asked. Ethan nodded. "I do." Davis took a breath, the weight of the decision pressing heavily on her shoulders. "All right," she said finally, "but you stay within sight of the officers. If things get out of hand, you get back immediately." Ethan agreed, and the room sprang back into action. Officers prepared to head out, and Jake was forced to confront the reality that the man he had just arrested was now stepping up to help in a way he couldn't. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Outside, the air was thick with tension. The alley behind the park had become a focal point of fear and unease. A crowd had gathered, their faces etched with worry. The suspects, 3 young men, stood their ground, makeshift weapons in hand, their expressions a blend of anger and desperation. Terrence, the leader of the group, gripped a crowbar, his knuckles white. Beside him, Jamal and Luis exchanged nervous glances, their bravado beginning to waver. Ethan approached cautiously, his hands visible and his demeanor calm. The crowd parted slightly to let him through, and whispers rippled through the onlookers. People recognized him, some as the accomplished businessman and advocate, others as the man who had just been unjustly arrested. But in that moment, none of that mattered. He was here, and he was stepping into the fire, hoping to bring peace. Terrence's eyes narrowed as he saw Ethan. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice cracking with the strain of holding himself together. "You're not one of them." Ethan held his hands out, a gesture of peace. "I'm not here to take sides," he said evenly. "I'm here because I care about you, about all of you. This doesn't have to end badly." Jamal's grip on his baseball bat loosened slightly. "Easy for you to say," he spat, though his voice was more defensive than angry. "They don't see us as people. They see us as threats." Ethan stepped closer, his heart pounding, but his face composed. "I know," he said. "And that's why we have to be smart. We have to show them that we're more than the stereotypes they put on us. We have to survive. You're too important to lose." Terrence's shoulders slumped, the weight of years of injustice pressing down on him. He had seen friends and family members taken away, some never coming back. The anger was a shield, but it was also a burden. He looked at Ethan, searching for any sign of weakness, but all he found was strength. Jake Miller stood at the edge of the scene, watching in disbelief. His hand rested on his holster, but he didn't draw. Something about Ethan's presence, his way of commanding respect without force, made Jake hesitate. For the first time, he wondered if there was a better way, a way he had never considered before. The crowd held its breath as Ethan continued speaking, his voice carrying through the tense silence. "We've all lost too much already," he said. "We can't afford to lose more. Put the weapons down and let's talk. Let's show them we're better than the world thinks we are." Terrence's eyes filled with tears he refused to shed. He looked at Jamal and Luis, searching for support, and found the same exhaustion mirrored in their faces. Slowly, painfully, he dropped the crowbar, the clang echoing like a gunshot. Jamal and Luis followed suit, their makeshift weapons falling to the ground. A collective sigh of relief rippled through the crowd. The tension didn't dissipate entirely, but the threat of violence had passed. Captain Davis stepped forward, her expression one of cautious respect. "Thank you, Mr. Carter," she said quietly. "You may have just saved lives today." Ethan nodded, but his heart felt heavy. He knew this was only a temporary victory, a small step in a much longer journey. But as he looked into the eyes of the young men he had helped calm, he knew it was a step worth taking. Sofia Ramirez, her phone still recording, whispered to herself, "This is history." She knew she had captured something powerful, a moment that could spark real change. Jake Miller, standing on the sidelines, felt his world shift. Everything he thought he knew, every instinct he had trusted, now felt uncertain. Watching Ethan diffuse the situation without force or violence made him question himself in a way he never had before. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the city. The day was far from over, but hope, fragile and fleeting, had found its way into the hearts of those who had witnessed Ethan's courage. The air outside the precinct was thick with the kind of tension that felt like it could be sliced with a knife. The sun had dipped lower in the sky, casting long, distorted shadows over the city streets. The alley behind Riverside Park had become a flashpoint, a microcosm of the larger struggles between law enforcement and the community. The scene was chaotic. Officers in tactical gear positioned themselves behind patrol cars, their radios buzzing with updates and orders. The crowd of onlookers had grown, and anxiety pulsed through the gathered masses. Ethan Carter walked alongside Captain Lauren Davis, his every step purposeful despite the heavy weight of what he was about to attempt. His heartbeat drummed in his ears, but he kept his breathing steady. He couldn't afford to let fear get the better of him. The community was watching, and more importantly, they were counting on him to bring calm to a situation teetering on the edge of disaster. Officer Jake Miller followed close behind, his face pale and strained. He still didn't trust Ethan. How could he, after everything that had just happened? But there was no denying the gravity of the situation or the reality that they needed every bit of help they could get. Jake's hand hovered near his holster, his instincts on high alert, but the truth was, he felt more out of control than ever. The scene ahead was chaos, raw and unnerving. As they neared the alley, Ethan could see the makeshift barricade that had been set up. 3 young men, all in their 20s, stood behind a dumpster and a row of trash cans, their faces hard with defiance but shadowed with fear. They were known in the neighborhood, part of a community that had long felt alienated from the authorities. Tensions between them and the police had been simmering for years, and now it felt like they had finally reached a boiling point. One of the men, a tall figure with dreadlocks and a scar across his cheek, held a crowbar in one hand. His eyes flashed with a mix of anger and desperation. His name was Terrence, a once promising high school athlete whose future had been derailed by a series of encounters with the police that had left him bitter and broken. Next to him, Jamal, a wiry man with quick, darting eyes, clutched a baseball bat. His body was coiled, every muscle taut like a wire about to snap. And finally, there was Luis, the youngest of the 3, who wore his fear more openly. His hands shook as he held a piece of wood, his eyes darting between the police and the growing crowd. Captain Davis held up a hand, signaling for her officers to hold their positions. The officers exchanged nervous glances, the situation escalating with every passing second. Some of them had sweat dripping down their temples despite the cool evening air. They knew how easily things could spiral out of control, how quickly a single wrong move could turn the scene into chaos. Davis herself felt the pressure, the responsibility heavy on her shoulders. She turned to Ethan, her expression a mix of hope and worry. "Remember," she said, her voice low but firm, "we're right here if you need us." Ethan nodded, swallowing the knot in his throat. He took a step forward, his hands held out in a gesture of peace. The crowd behind him murmured, their curiosity and fear palpable. Parents pulled their children closer, and bystanders exchanged tense, worried looks. The young men in the alley tensed, their bodies coiled like springs, ready to react to any sign of aggression. "Terrence," Ethan called out, his voice calm and measured. "It's me, Ethan Carter." Terrence's eyes flicked to Ethan, a flash of recognition breaking through the storm of emotions on his face. "Ethan," he echoed, his grip on the crowbar loosening slightly. But the tension didn't fully dissipate. "What are you doing here, man? This isn't your fight." Ethan took another step forward, carefully avoiding any sudden movements. He could feel every pair of eyes on him, the weight of the moment pressing heavily on his chest. "It is my fight," he replied, his voice steady. "It's all of ours, but we have to be smart. We have to think about the bigger picture." Jamal spat on the ground, his face twisted with anger. "The bigger picture?" he snapped, his voice tight with rage. "They've been coming after us for years, Ethan. You know that. How many times do we have to take this before something changes?" His words were raw, echoing the pain and frustration that had built up over a lifetime of feeling powerless. Ethan's heart ached at the truth in Jamal's words. He had seen the injustice, felt it in his own life, and yet here he was, trying to convince these men not to fight in a way that could only make things worse. He knew how hollow his words might sound to them, but he had to try. "I know," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I know how unfair it is. I've felt it too. But this isn't the way. We need to stay alive if we want to change anything." Luis's hands trembled more visibly now. He looked at Ethan, his eyes wide and vulnerable. His youth was palpable, the fear of a boy caught in a world that expected him to be a man. "What do we do then?" he asked, his voice cracking. "Just keep taking it? Let them treat us like we're nothing?" Ethan took a deep breath, feeling the weight of their pain and frustration. He wished he had a simple answer, but he knew there was none. "We fight," he said, his voice growing stronger. "But we fight smart. We make them listen. We make them see us, see our worth, and we don't let them forget it." Terrence's shoulders finally slumped, the crowbar falling from his grip and clattering onto the pavement. His eyes glistened with unshed tears, a mixture of relief and exhaustion washing over him. "I'm so tired, Ethan," he whispered. "We're all so tired." Ethan stepped closer, lowering his hands but keeping his body language open. "I know," he said softly, "but we can't give up. We owe it to ourselves, to everyone we've lost, to keep going." Slowly, the other men lowered their makeshift weapons. Jamal let the baseball bat slip from his fingers, and Luis dropped the piece of wood he'd been clutching. The tension in the alley seemed to dissipate, replaced by a fragile, aching calm. People in the crowd released the collective breath they'd been holding, some wiping tears from their eyes. Parents hugged their children tighter, and friends exchanged glances filled with relief. Captain Davis stepped forward, signaling for her officers to stand down. She approached cautiously, her expression one of deep respect. "Thank you, Mr. Carter," she said quietly. "You may have just saved lives today." Ethan nodded, but his heart felt heavy. He knew this was only a temporary victory, a small step in a much longer journey. But as he looked into the eyes of the young men he had helped calm, he knew it was a step worth taking. Jake Miller stood a few paces away, his mind reeling. Everything he had assumed, every bias he had clung to, felt hollow now. Watching Ethan in action, seeing the way he commanded respect and diffused a situation with nothing but his words, Jake realized that perhaps he had been wrong, not just today, but for a long time. The certainty he had once felt about his role, about the people he was meant to protect, was crumbling. Sofia Ramirez's camera captured it all. The journalist's hands trembled with the weight of what she had just witnessed. This was more than a story. It was a testament to the power of words, of community, of refusing to be broken. The footage would be shared far and wide, she knew, but it was up to the viewers to decide what to do with the message. Darnell Williams, the street musician who had followed the unfolding drama from the precinct, wiped at his eyes. The saxophone case at his side felt heavier than usual. The melody he had played in the park echoed in his mind, bitter-sweet and full of longing. He had seen too many moments like this one go the other way, end in loss and grief. But today, he had witnessed something different, something that made him believe, even if only for a moment, that change was possible. The crowd began to disperse slowly, some people staying to exchange words of gratitude with Ethan or to comfort each other. A few officers spoke quietly to community members, an uneasy but significant step toward reconciliation. In the background, the noise of the city began to return, but it felt different, as though the echoes of the standoff had left an indelible mark. Ethan, his body finally starting to feel the exhaustion of the day, took a moment to close his eyes. He felt a wave of relief, but it was tempered by the knowledge of how much work still lay ahead. Yet as he opened his eyes and saw the small, hopeful exchanges happening around him, he knew this victory, however small, was meaningful. The precinct felt different that evening. The air, once heavy with tension and mistrust, now carried a sense of cautious optimism. The chaos from the alley had been defused, and the crowd of onlookers was beginning to disperse, murmuring quietly among themselves. The echoes of Ethan Carter's words still hung in the air, resonating with those who had witnessed the remarkable power of calm and reason over force and aggression. Inside the precinct, Ethan sat at a small table in a side office. The room was bare, with fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows, but Ethan's presence seemed to soften it somehow. He cradled a cup of lukewarm coffee in his hands, his gaze distant and thoughtful. The exhaustion that he had held back for hours now washed over him, but he refused to let himself fully relax. There was still work to be done. Captain Lauren Davis entered the room quietly, her face drawn with a mix of weariness and respect. She carried a folder of paperwork, but it was clear her focus wasn't on the documents. "Mr. Carter," she began, her voice softer than before, "I can't begin to express how grateful I am for what you did out there." Ethan looked up, his eyes meeting hers. He could see the sincerity in her expression, but also the burden of her position. "I did what I had to do," he replied, his voice steady. "But what happened today shouldn't have happened in the first place." Davis nodded, a shadow of guilt crossing her face. "You're right," she admitted. "The way Officer Miller handled things, it was unacceptable. We've reviewed the body cam footage and disciplinary action will be taken. This precinct has to do better, and it starts with accountability." Ethan's jaw tightened. "It's not just about one officer," he said. "It's about the system that allows this kind of behavior to go unchecked. You can discipline Miller, but if nothing changes beyond that, it'll keep happening." Davis took a deep breath, the weight of her responsibilities pressing heavily on her. The precinct had long been a reflection of the broader issues in the city: deep-seated mistrust between law enforcement and the community, incidents of bias that went unaddressed, and a culture that often prioritized self-preservation over meaningful change. She knew Ethan was right. It would take more than one action to make a difference. "I know," she said finally, her voice carrying the exhaustion of years spent trying to balance the demands of her role with her own sense of justice. "And I promise you, this incident has opened our eyes to the urgent need for change. We'll be implementing new training programs, focused on bias awareness and de-escalation tactics. But more than that, we need to rebuild trust with the community." Ethan studied her, searching for any hint of insincerity. He had heard promises before, seen good intentions get lost in bureaucracy. But there was something different about Davis's resolve, a spark of genuine commitment that gave him a sliver of hope. Still, he knew better than to rely solely on hope. Real change demanded vigilance and continued pressure. "I'll hold you to that," he said finally, his voice carrying both exhaustion and determination. "This can't just be about damage control." Davis's shoulders seemed to relax slightly, as if the burden of acknowledging the truth had been momentarily lifted. She reached into the folder she was holding and pulled out a document, sliding it across the table toward Ethan. "We're establishing a community oversight board," she explained. "We want representatives from the neighborhoods most affected by our policing practices to have a say in how we operate. I'd like to invite you to be part of that process." Ethan glanced at the document, the words blurring momentarily in his tired eyes. The idea was a step in the right direction, a tangible effort to give the community a voice. But he knew it wouldn't be easy. There would be resistance, pushback from those who preferred the status quo. "I'll think about it," he said, his voice cautious. "But I want to make sure this isn't just a way to placate us." Davis's expression hardened with resolve. "It's not," she said firmly. "If we're going to make real change, We need people like you holding us accountable." Meanwhile, in the main office area, Jake Miller sat at his desk, his head in his hands. The events of the day replayed in his mind, each moment a stinging reminder of his misjudgments. His gut, the instincts he had relied on for so many years, had betrayed him, and he was left grappling with the reality that his actions had nearly led to tragedy. The words Ethan had spoken to him earlier echoed in his mind, carrying a challenge that Jake wasn't sure he was strong enough to face. Detective Marcus Lee approached, his usual stoic demeanor softened with understanding. He placed a hand on Jake's shoulder, and the younger officer looked up, his eyes red-rimmed with fatigue and regret. The precinct had become quieter, the frantic energy of the earlier crisis now replaced by a heavy silence that felt almost suffocating. "You messed up, Jake," Marcus said bluntly, but his voice wasn't unkind. He had been a mentor to Jake, had seen him grow from an eager rookie to a seasoned officer. But he also knew that experience didn't always equate to wisdom. But what matters now is what you do next. You have a chance to learn from this, to change. Jake's throat tightened. "I don't know if I can," he whispered. "I thought I was doing my job, protecting the community, but I was wrong. I let my biases control me." The admission felt like a weight being lifted, but it left behind a hollow sense of uncertainty. What did it mean to protect and serve if his instincts were so flawed? Marcus's grip on Jake's shoulder tightened. "Acknowledging that is the first step," he said. "We've all got things we need to unlearn, but if you're willing to put in the work, there's hope." Marcus knew how difficult it was to confront the darkness in one's own heart, to admit that the stories they had been told, the narratives they had internalized, weren't always true. Jake nodded slowly, the words sinking in. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but the idea of change, of becoming a better person and a better officer, felt like a lifeline he desperately needed. He had spent years believing he was one of the good guys, that his intentions alone were enough. Now he realized that intention without introspection could be dangerous. Outside the precinct, the streetlights had flickered on, casting a golden glow over the quiet streets. The world seemed to have slowed down, as if holding its breath in the wake of everything that had happened. Sofia Ramirez stood near the entrance, reviewing the footage she had recorded earlier. Her heart was still racing, and she knew that the story she was about to publish would make waves. But she also understood the weight of her responsibility to tell the story with truth and integrity, to honor Ethan's courage and the struggles of the community. Darnell Williams, the street musician, approached her, his saxophone case slung over his shoulder. He had stayed to witness the aftermath, his heart heavy with both relief and lingering sorrow. He had been there when the tension crackled like a live wire, and he had watched Ethan work a kind of miracle with nothing but his voice. "You got everything you need?" he asked Sophia, his voice rough with emotion. Sophia looked up, meeting his gaze. "I think so," she said, her voice quiet. "But this isn't just a story, it's a call to action." She had seen many stories come and go, watched public interest flare up and then fade away, but something about today felt different. There was a rawness, a vulnerability in the air that made her believe real change might be possible. Darnell nodded, his eyes reflecting the years of pain and hope that had shaped his life. "Make sure they hear it then," he said, his voice cracking. "Make sure they see us." He had been making music in this city for decades, had seen movements rise and fall, but he had never stopped believing in the power of storytelling. Sophia's grip on her phone tightened. "I will," she promised, a sense of purpose surging through her. She knew her words had the power to shape public perception, to amplify the voices that had too often been silenced. Back inside, Ethan stood up from the table, ready to leave. Captain Davis offered her hand, and he shook it, a silent agreement passing between them. As he walked toward the exit, he paused by Jake's desk. The two men locked eyes, and for a moment the world seemed to hold its breath. There was so much history, so much pain, hanging between them. But there was also the possibility of something more, growth perhaps, or understanding. Jake stood up, his hands trembling. "Ethan," he said, his voice thick with regret. I'm sorry. I know that doesn't change what happened, but I am." His voice broke slightly, the vulnerability of the moment threatening to unravel him. He had always prided himself on being in control, but today had shattered that illusion. Ethan studied him, the weight of the day pressing down on his shoulders. He could see the sincerity in Jake's eyes, but also the uncertainty, the struggle of a man trying to reconcile his beliefs with the truth. "It's a start," Ethan said finally, "but actions speak louder than words. Make sure your apology isn't just words." Jake nodded, his jaw tightening with determination. "I will," he vowed, the words feeling like both a promise and a burden. He wasn't sure what the path forward would look like, but he knew he had to take it. As Ethan stepped out into the night, he was met with a cool breeze that carried the scent of autumn leaves. He closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the exhaustion settle into his bones. But there was also a spark of something else. Hope. It was fragile, but it was there. Sophia approached him, her phone tucked away. "Thank you," she said, her voice filled with admiration, "for everything you did today." She had seen courage in many forms, but Ethan's brand of courage, a quiet, unyielding strength, had left her awed. Ethan gave her a tired smile. "The work doesn't end here," he said, "but I'm glad the story will be told." Sophia nodded, her eyes shining with determination. "It will, and people will listen." She hoped that this story, once shared, would spark the conversations and actions that were desperately needed. Ethan looked out at the city, the lights twinkling like stars in the distance. Change was slow, often painful, but it was possible. And as long as there were people willing to fight for it, there was hope. A few weeks had passed since the incident at Riverside Park and the tense standoff in the alley. The city had begun to heal, but the scars remained, a reminder of how much work still lay ahead. Conversations about racial profiling, community trust, and police accountability were being had in the city council meetings, neighborhood gatherings, and news broadcasts. The story of Ethan Carter's arrest and his heroic act of de-escalation had spread far and wide, sparking a wave of public discourse. Ethan stood at the front of a packed community center, a microphone in hand. The large room was filled with people from all walks of life: city officials, community leaders, police officers in uniform, and residents who had come to hear him speak. The energy in the room was a mix of anticipation, hope, and a lingering sense of urgency. He took a deep breath, scanning the faces in the crowd. He recognized many of them, people he had fought alongside in the struggle for equality, friends who had supported him through his journey, and even some of the officers who had doubted him. His eyes found Jake Miller, standing in the back, his posture less rigid than before, his expression one of contemplation and humility. "Thank you all for being here," Ethan began, his voice steady but powerful. What happened a few weeks ago was not just an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a deeper problem, one that we've been fighting for generations. But today, we're not here to point fingers or place blame. We're here to talk about solutions, about moving forward together. The room was silent, hanging on to his every word. He could feel the weight of their expectations, the desire for change that had been building for so long. "Change doesn't happen overnight," he continued. "It's slow, it's hard, and it requires all of us to look inward and confront the biases we carry. But it's not impossible. We've seen that when we come together, when we listen to each other, real progress can be made." The room remained quiet, but the silence was now charged with a sense of shared purpose. Ethan could feel the energy, the hope, and even the skepticism. He knew that not everyone in the room was fully convinced, but he also knew that change often began with doubt, slowly transforming into belief. In the back of the room, Jake shifted uncomfortably, but remained focused on Ethan's words. He had been attending bias training sessions, as ordered by the precinct, but he knew that changing his mindset would take more than just a few workshops. It was a journey, one that he was only just beginning. The sessions had forced him to confront uncomfortable truths about himself, about the assumptions he had carried for years. It was hard, messy work, but he was committed to it. Ethan's gaze swept over to Captain Lauren Davis, who sat near the front. She had become an unlikely ally in the weeks following the incident, working tirelessly to implement the changes she had promised. New training programs were in place, and a community advisory board had been established to oversee police conduct and ensure accountability. Davis had even begun attending community meetings, listening to the stories of those who had long felt unheard. Her presence had been met with initial skepticism, but she remained steadfast, determined to earn back the trust that had been broken. "We have to hold each other accountable," Ethan said, his voice rising with passion. "We have to demand better from our leaders, from our institutions, and from ourselves. It's the only way we can build a society where everyone is treated with the dignity and respect they deserve." A ripple of applause spread through the crowd, but Ethan wasn't done yet. "This isn't just about policy changes or police reform," he added. "It's about changing hearts and minds. It's about teaching our children to see each other as equals, to celebrate our differences instead of fearing them." In the crowd, a young boy with wide, curious eyes watched Ethan intently. The boy held a small notebook, and beside him, his mother whispered about the importance of people like Ethan. The boy didn't fully understand everything, but he felt the power of Ethan's words, the hope they carried. A woman named Maria, who had been on the fence about attending the meeting, listened with tears in her eyes. Her brother had been a victim of police brutality years ago, and she had struggled to believe that change was possible. Yet hearing Ethan speak, seeing the genuine effort from people like Davis and even Jake, made her feel something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Maybe, just maybe, there was a chance to heal. When Ethan finished his speech, the room erupted into applause. People stood clapping and cheering, but he remained humble, offering a grateful smile before stepping down from the podium. Sofia Ramirez approached him, her notebook in hand and a determined expression on her face. "That was incredible," she said. "I think your message will resonate far and wide." She had written countless articles about social justice, but this story felt different. It was as if the city itself was on the cusp of a new beginning, and she wanted to capture every moment of it. Ethan nodded, his eyes softening. "I hope so. But the real work starts now. It's up to all of us to make sure this momentum doesn't fade." His voice was tired but unwavering. He knew that speeches and promises were only the first step. Sustained action was what truly made a difference. Sofia smiled. "You can count on me to keep the story alive." She had already planned a series of follow-up pieces, interviews with community leaders, and updates on the changes being implemented. Her reporting would be thorough, and she hoped it would inspire others to get involved. Nearby, Darnell Williams pulled out his saxophone and began to play a soulful tune, one that echoed through the community center and spilled out into the streets. People began to gather around, the music drawing them together, a reminder of the unity that could be found even in the face of division. Darnell played with his eyes closed, the melody both mournful and hopeful, a reflection of the city's journey. Jake approached Ethan cautiously, his hands shoved into his pockets. He looked like a man carrying the weight of regret and the desire to make amends. "Ethan," he said, his voice low but sincere, "I wanted to say thank you for what you did in that alley, for not giving up on this city, even when it's given you every reason to." Ethan turned to him, his expression thoughtful. "Thank you for being here, Jake," he replied. "The fact that you're willing to listen, to change, means a lot. But it's not just about words. It's about what you do from here on out." Jake nodded, understanding the challenge in Ethan's words. "I won't let you down." The promise felt heavy, but he was determined to keep it. He had started volunteering at community centers, trying to understand the people he had once viewed with suspicion. It was a small step, but it was a start. The two men exchanged a brief but meaningful handshake, a small gesture that carried the weight of forgiveness, accountability, and hope for the future. As the evening wore on, the community center became a place of celebration and connection. People shared stories, laughed, and planned for the future. Ethan stood near the entrance, watching as the community he loved came together, stronger and more united than ever. It was a moment of peace, a reminder that even in the darkest times, light could be found. The young boy from earlier approached, his notebook clutched tightly in his hands. "Mr. Carter?" he asked, his voice small but brave. "Can I have your autograph?" Ethan's heart warmed, and he knelt down to the boy's level. "Of course," he said, taking the pen and signing his name with a flourish. The boy's eyes lit up, and his mother beamed with pride. As Ethan stood back up, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. The fight was far from over, but moments like these reminded him of why he kept going. Change was possible, and he would continue to fight for it. One conversation, one action, one heart at a time. The music swelled, carrying with it the promise of a better tomorrow. And as the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, Ethan knew that hope was still very much alive.